This is a meeting of the Digital Culture, Media and Sport Select Committee. It's part of our investigation into misinformation and trusted voices. We have 4 witnesses this morning. Thank you all very much for coming. We have David Dismore, the Chief Operating Officer at News UK, Alison Phillips, the editor of the Daily Mirror, Nick Hopkins, the executive editor of News at the Guardian, and Peter Wright, editor emeritus of DMG Media. In terms of interests, I suppose I should declare that I used to work for the Times a long time ago. Does anyone else want to declare any interests?
Yeah, I've written as a freelancer for the Guardian, and I have presented as a radio host for Talk Radio.
Anyone else? Okay. Thank you. Well, let's sort of start off. And just to explain to our guests, a lot of the discussions we've been having in this inquiry have been about coverage, both in newspapers and broadcasting and online during the pandemic, when clearly the quality of news and information going out was genuinely a matter of life and death for the whole country. So that was an area of great sensitivity. So if I can, as it were, go along the line left to right, who did your organisation look to for reliable advice during the pandemic?
I want to start with me.
Yeah.
Sorry, it's the left and right.
Yeah, sorry.
Good morning. So we would have gone to a number of sources during the pandemic. I mean, there were the daily briefings that were coming from government. There were daily briefings that were coming from scientists and science-based organisations. But both in the UK and further afield as well. So there would have been you would have had that sort of daily drumbeat of information, but also our journalists were given the scope to go and find different angles, different themes, encouraged to write longer form pieces as well, so that, as one put it, get away from the fog of the story and into the nuance. So there are all kinds of sources for a big global story like that. In fact, probably the biggest global story that we've seen in our lifetimes. So actually putting it down to where do you go for information is very difficult, because the information is all around and there are so many different angles to it.
Yeah. I mean, that's a fair point. So let me, as we move along the panel, ask a slightly different question, which is, did you discover quickly who was reliable and who wasn't?
No, I don't think we did. I mean, we encourage all our correspondents to canvass as many experts in the field as possible. And I think what we discovered was that, and it was by the nature of the fact this was a new virus, that no one had full understanding or knowledge at any particular time. There were some organisations that I think came out better than others in terms of the information they gave us. I'm thinking about the ONS, I'm thinking about the UK HSA. I think the Science Media Centre was an invaluable resource in terms of giving different voices at specific times during the pandemic. But certainly talking to our science editor, Ian Sample, and one of his colleagues, Nicola Davis, just before this session, it was very clear to me that they didn't feel they could trust any particular source without at least trying to triangulate with other experts.
So I had a conversation with our health editor before this, Martin Baggett, who's obviously the person in the field. So I think, to Nick's point, there was some concern at the beginning because it was so unknown, although fairly quickly the daily briefings were incredibly useful. And then I think the other major advantage that we had was the Science Medical Centre, which Nick mentioned about, which I think was always there as a backstop when people wanted to sort of sense check anything that they were hearing from lots of different sources. So they were hugely important. And I think, as with kind of all journalism, at the beginning, if you've got a source and you're not entirely certain whether it's going to be right or wrong, you check it and you check it again, and then it becomes clear which are the ones that you can keep going back to that are reliable and are closest. But obviously, as we've seen subsequently, there was lots of different perspectives and lots of different, and so it was very much a case of feeling the weight. But we feel that with the daily briefings, with the MRHA, Public Health England, they were there. There was certainly a lot of information available to us.
Well, I'd give a very similar answer. I mean, we had an awful lot of journalists, not just medical and science correspondents, working on this. I think I worked out at one point 80% of our online content was COVID-related in one way or another. And information was coming in from all over the world. And, I mean, some aspects of the daily briefings and government policy seemed fairly incontrovertible, like the vaccine programme, although there were people out there who were decrying it. Others, like lockdown, and I'm sure we'll get on to the Telegraph revelations this week, but clearly the science was completely unsettled, and that was the sense we had at the time. And we looked a lot at what other countries were doing, the experience of Sweden, New Zealand, China, people at different ends of the spectrum, and tried to work out what was working. But it was evolving. I mean, nobody knew the answers to begin with.
Yeah.
We probably don't now.
You correctly give us two of the obvious follow-ups I was going to do, which is sort of the same question but with different contexts. The first of which is, did you ever, and in retrospect, should you have allowed anti-vax voices any publicity? Did you ever, I mean, apart from reporting demos and things like that, did you allow the opinion that the vaccines were Bill Gates putting chips in us or anything?
I mean, someone will now produce some story we wrote, but it certainly always seemed to me, and I'm not the editor, but that the case for vaccine was extremely strong, and that lockdown was only a stopgap measure. There were doubts expressed, I remember, about the safety of the AstraZeneca vaccine, which of course we had to report. But the sort of the uninformed, emotional anti-vaccine message, I don't think I ever gave any credence to. I did slightly wonder at the time. I mean, there was a lot of noise about anti-vaxxers, and I did slightly wonder at the time whether the amount of coverage the subject was given was actually counterproductive, because it was encouraging people to think, well, perhaps there's something in this. But anyway, no.
Alison, did you?
No is the short answer. However, we were very, very conscious of the volume of anti-vax content that was out there, that was circulating on social media, and particularly in WhatsApp groups, which I think is a real issue because it goes unseen. It particularly perhaps goes unseen by people within the mainstream media, people like yourselves, perhaps.
Not all WhatsApps.
Not all WhatsApp groups, but there's this idea about how information circulates that can be unseen by a lot of people in power quite often. And we became very aware of that, and because particularly some of the people who may have fallen under the influence of that information are people who, traditionally would have come to like a mainstream tabloid organisation. So we always take the opinion with something like that. We can't just tell everybody they're stupid. So we did a lot of myth-busting Q&As, trying to explain why certain information was wrong, and trying to put the facts out there, but in a way that isn't telling everyone that they're stupid, because that's the only way you can really counteract misinformation.
Yeah. The Guardian has a different market, so
Yes.
how do you...
No, but I mean, we took the same approach, which was we wanted to. My recollection in news is that we wanted to interrogate where this was coming from, who was speaking the anti-vax message, what were their credentials, what was the background to them, try and wrap the issue in that kind of context, because we couldn't just completely ignore it, but neither did we want to give a platform to conspiracy theorists.
David?
Yeah, I mean,
You're coming at it from, as it were, both ends of the market as well.
yeah, and I think it's also important to point out that, unlike Nick and Alison, I am not currently at the sharp end of editing newspapers, which I've done in the past. But I would agree with everything that's been said. I think as well, during the pandemic, the government chose to do a lot of advertising messaging through news brands. Because it was found that they gained, or the message had a lot more trust and credence as a result of being in that trusted environment. There's no doubt that I think news brands played a really important role during the pandemic of getting out reliable information, as people were crying out for that, because there was so much misinformation or the anti-vax message, and then there was a lot of debate also around lockdown, which was the other one, which we would certainly have surfaced the lockdown debate, because I think that was probably more debatable, if I can put it like that. But on the whole, it was here is what we think is the consensus approach. Here is the myth busting. If you're wondering about it, this is probably, with the best information we have available to us, the way that we should be moving forward at this point in time.
I mean, you make the point about lockdown, and clearly this week's revelations make it more relevant. I mean, I'm struck in retrospect that no paper actually sort of started campaigning against lockdown as a tool, despite all the arguments about Sweden and other countries that did it. Sort of in retrospect, did that argument get underplayed by mainstream papers, do you think, the anti-lockdown argument?
It is so easy to have an opinion with hindsight. I mean, we were in the height or in the midst of something that we'd never encountered before. No one knew what it was going to do to us. There was the country was in a genuine state of fear. It had, there was the real danger that the NHS was going to fall over. Those were all the arguments as to why we should be locking down, and I think it was important that the country got behind that policy, and there was consensus in Parliament, and I think consensus in the general population. As things then went further, you could possibly make the argument that you didn't need the third or fourth lockdown, possibly, but it had got us that far, and actually we've come out the other end of it reasonably intact. So I think it is, we should always be asking questions, but at the same time, where there is a national need, I think it is, you get behind that need.
Yeah, I mean, my recollection is there were some voices, fringe voices, who were anti-lockdown. But, as David says, I mean, it's easy to forget now that it felt we were in a state of panic, a state of emergency. And you can look back with hindsight and think all manner of different things. But at the time, our mortality rates were very high, our hospitals were full up. That was where that was what we were focused on. And I think most people were focused on that. It's only now the pandemic is subsiding that those fringe voices have got more of a platform.
Yes, I think, as Nick says, there were some people that were questioning lockdown, particularly when we went into the third and fourth. I mean, I think the Telegraph perhaps was more questioning of it. But I think also we've got to remember we serve our audiences. So we serve a print audience and a digital audience, and probably all of our print audiences are slightly older, they're more conscious about their health. I mean, if you take a mirror audience and you ask them to choose between a mirror print audience, you ask them to choose health and wealth, they're always going to go with health. So all the economic arguments about lockdown perhaps were of less value to staying alive at that point. So we are there to serve our audiences as well. So when you get to a digital audience, perhaps slightly younger, sort of more young people who are adversely affected economically and also in terms of things like mental health than they were actually the physical effects of COVID, that's slightly different as well. So, but in hindsight, yes, possibly there could have been more questions asked about lockdown and the impacts, particularly on younger people. But they did start to come out, I think, towards the end of the end of it all.
Yeah. I mean, the Mail you'd have thought might be on the sort of anti-lockdown edge of the argument.
I think we became increasingly sceptical, and we were certainly very worried about the effect on education, on children, and the effect on the economy, and you know whether it was actually working, and that's one of the reasons that we devoted quite a lot of effort to look at countries like Sweden that were handling it differently. There were also, I mean, this is opinion rather than reporting, but certainly my friend Peter Hitchens on the Mail on Sunday was very sceptical all along. And so there were always sceptical voices. But I do agree with my colleagues that whatever we've now learned, it's hard to see what the government could have done at the beginning, given how little we knew about all this and the fact there was no vaccine available.
Yeah. And is that what it felt like at the time? Because obviously this is an inquiry into trusted voices, and I think David made the point that, and Alison, you've each got clearly a different market, and you want your readers to trust you, and particularly in the context of an online world where all kinds of craziness is going on and a lot of people are believing it. Did you see the role as very much as saying, hang on, don't believe these mad voices, we've actually done some proper journalism on this, so even in a climate of deep uncertainty about what would happen next, because the whole world didn't know anything about this pandemic, that you had that role to play?
I think we did on vaccine, and we were very sceptical about some of the miracle cures that were being touted.
Leach.
Yes. Although even there were occasionally sort of contradictory stories from possibly reputable sources that had to be looked into. But we were, I repeat, I can't really see what else the government could have done. I mean, I don't think the government could have stood there and said the answer to this is herd immunity, which in the end it is, and therefore a lot of British citizens are going to lose their lives because we won't achieve it straight away. I mean, you couldn't have done that. We were certainly sceptical and critical of the way lockdown applied to care homes. There was a lot of concern about that.
Thanks. Yeah, I want to continue on some of these themes. You're from different sort of titles, different traditions, different politics. I just wondered, in this day and age, you're competing with different stuff. I imagine the circulations are declining from the heyday of Fleet Street. What do people look for who still sort of reliably buy a newspaper? And Peter Wright, interestingly, the Metro, is that the one with the biggest circulation because you just kind of pick it up without trying on the tube every morning? So just wondered, what are the circulation figures? Who reads it compared to the Mail, compared to the online version for all of you?
Yeah, Metro was hit very badly by lockdown, as you can imagine, very badly indeed. And prior to lockdown, it was the biggest by circulation. Metro Metro appeals to young people because it's a commuter newspaper, and its policy is to be incredibly straightforward in its reporting of news. I mean, it will give you short stories without spin, and try to sort of keep as close to common ground as it possibly can. The Mail, by contrast, the newspaper, rather than online, has an older readership. It's a campaigning paper. It has a political view, and it's not afraid of expressing it. Mail Online has a much younger audience.
Is it still the most read website in the world? For a while it was, wasn't it?
It was the most read newspaper website.
Right.
The BBC's bigger. But yeah, I mean, I was just checking the latest figures. There are 180 million unique visitors every month.
What's that compared to the newspaper?
The newspaper, I think, currently sells somewhere between 600,000 and 700,000 copies. So readership, you can multiply that by 2.5.
Mail on Sunday, a bit more because of the colour magazine?
No, slightly less.
Oh, really? Okay. And Metro, what's that? Is that the biggest of all?
I'm afraid I haven't
no
got the figure, but it's in a similar region.
And that 600,000 to 700,000 is down on what it was a couple of decades ago, I'm imagining.
When I left the Mail on Sunday in 2012, we were selling 2 million, and the Daily Mail was selling something similar. In its heyday, we were selling some Sundays we sold over 2.5 million. And I'm sure everybody along here will be telling exactly the same story. I'm afraid newspapers will not be with us forever, and the problem is that the advertising has gone online. All the marginal costs have increased. Newsprint is more expensive because we're buying it in smaller quantities. The paper industry is in serious problems, and if you're not taking advertising revenue, you have to put your cover price up, and cover prices become a larger and larger percentage of our revenue. And of course, when you put the cover price up, you lose sales. It's inevitable. And I doubt if anybody's got a different story to tell, I'm afraid.
Yeah, Alison, you answered it a
No,
bit.
sadly we don't have a different story to tell. So, I mean, print circulation has gone down, but I don't think. But digital, the Mirror is actually reaching more people in many ways than it ever has done. So, we'll get 10 million hits a day on our website. So there's the opportunity we're reaching a younger audience. So, but we kind of almost like playing those two audiences. I like to think sort of our digital audience and our print audience, they're it's like a sort of a father and son. They sort of share the same values and the same beliefs, but they might wear different clothes. So that's the kind of the how we operate. In print, as Peter says, cover price increases, which we've seen many of. Unfortunately, we are losing readers, but there is a huge loyalty amongst those people that do stay. So in many regards, we almost regard the Mirror as a kind of a club that just so happens to bring out a daily news product, because there is a real sort of sense of belonging. And that was hugely powerful in the early days of COVID, because for people that weren't even leaving their homes, they were still, our sale really held up during COVID. So if people were going out for one thing, it was to go out and buy a paper, because that was kind of their connection to the world. And also it was something that allowed people to fill their days. It was something to do. And we felt our role in people's lives grew enormously during that period. And the relationship we had with our print readers grew enormously during that period, even though it had always been strong. So there's that. And then, but obviously so much of the work that we're trying to do, as I'm sure our colleagues are, is to replicate that kind of depth of relationship with our digital readers. But of course, the way people access digital news is quite different. Largely, people reach digital news through their Facebook feed or through their social media platforms, whoever they use. So it's much more of a pick and mix. So somebody picks up their phone in the morning, they go onto Facebook and they might see one story from the Mail, the next story from the Mirror, the next story from the Guardian. And so it's a very different relationship, and it's much harder to build those that loyalty. The dream is that people wake up in the morning and they go to a destination website, which, I mean, the Guardian's gone a long way in that regard. Obviously the BBC's cleaned up because it's free, and then but that's how we're all trying to kind of get out those relationships digitally.
So younger people just not in the habit of picking up a newspaper anymore?
Oh no, no. I mean that's fine as long as people are accessing their news somewhere. But the harder bit isn't so much that they're not picking up a newspaper; it's more that they've grown up not recognising the need to pay for news. So that's where it gets really difficult.
That's Metro's fault.
Well, it's digital, really.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And what's the circulation out of interest?
So we're around about 330 now.
Okay, and the Guardian?
I can't give you the circulation figures because as head of news, it's not something that I'm necessarily, I keep details of. I can certainly get them to you. I
imagine it's pretty big because you're not behind a paywall or anything, are you?
Well, our readership online is huge, and regularly we're between sort of 40 and 50 million readers or page views being read a day. During COVID, it was much higher than that still. In fact, we saw a massive spike in traffic throughout the pandemic, and like everyone else, I mean, I know that there's been a gradual decline in our paper readership through that time, but we do have loyal Guardian paper readers, and we don't necessarily think that they're the same readers as the ones we have online.
How do you keep them? The crosswords?
No.
They're online as well.
No, I mean, I would say this. I think the Guardian is a sort of terrific mix of very, very trusted news, and I think our news throughout the pandemic was very highly regarded and very well trusted from the research that has been done on this. And it's always been a good mix of, news, investigations, highly opinionated pieces in our opinion section. So people still like it.
David Dismore, how do you sort of straddle the divide between the quality, the tabloids, and what do people look for in a newspaper who stuck with it?
So I want to tell a positive story about this, and I think you shouldn't think in terms of print and digital. I think you should think in terms of total audience.
You are behind a paywall, aren't you?
On the Times, yeah. And we have an organisation called PAMCO, which I think stands for the Publishers Audience Measurement Company, and they do an independent survey a couple of times a year, which gives total audiences of newspapers. Dedupes print and digital, so you get to the right figure, and that has the Sun is the biggest in the country at around 30 million, Mirror just behind that, Mail just behind that in terms of total audience.
This is hits on the internet, yeah.
Both print and digital. So looking at the total audience, the number of people who consume the brand at a point in the month. And as I say, that's where you get to that total audience number. So that's a huge reach. And if you compare that, I mean, I was looking at some figures earlier, and in the 15 to 34 age group, which would be predominantly digital, we as news brands are reaching 14 million across print and online every month, which is 6 million more than Snapchat and 5 million more than TikTok. Now, you'd be forgiven for thinking everybody was on TikTok and Snapchat, but actually they're consuming ours in greater numbers, which is a really good story going forward. And then the other thing is the evolution of news and how it has changed in recent years. So if you take the Times, for example, still got a strong print sale that will go from about 300,000 during the week up to 500,000 at the weekends.
Sunday Times.
Sunday Times is about that. Saturday is the biggest selling day of the week, except on the Times, where the Sunday Times outstrips it. But the Mail's biggest sale is on a Saturday. It does over 1 million. Sun does over 1 million on a Saturday as well. So Saturday is now the new Sunday in that respect. But Times has evolved from being a print product alone to website, apps, and now a radio station as well to increase its reach. So we launched Times Radio at the height of the pandemic, actually, which has opened us up to a whole new audience, but also given our journalists another way of reaching their existing audience as well. So, what were traditionally newspapers are now, that's why we refer to them as news brands, different ways of communicating, and that is what the audiences require.
And how do you keep your readers of the print version? Page 3 is gone, I think, hasn't it?
Page 3 has gone, 2015. Again, there's no doubt that print sales are declining, but there is still a really loyal base there, predominantly in the sort of over 50, over 60 category. And actually, when you get into the over 70 category, the usage of the internet among our readerships, and I think the Mirror in fact, I know the Mirror is similar in this, is really low. So in that sort of C2DE demographic, use of the internet is not a daily habit. So won't have smartphones and will rely on print to get their information. So it's really important that we keep print alive for that demographic for the next couple of decades.
So these elements of what people look for in a newspaper, how did they inform your COVID coverage, all of you, say compared to the Brexit coverage? I mean, were you sort of trying to reflect back at what your readers think, or did you see it as a more of a informing what the government line was?
Yeah, look,
compared to those
I think the
big stories.
We've already covered. I think the predominant feeling among the readership and among the country was one of fear as we went into this. What does this mean? What does it mean for me? What does it mean for my family? How do I protect me? How do I protect my family? Those were the sort of these were pretty base questions that we were trying to answer. And I think that was. I personally think news brands played a blinder during this period, as Peter said. Basically every journalist was working on this story and trying to produce as much trusted and trustworthy information as possible, asking questions when there were questions there to be asked, but also getting across the key messages when they did have to be got across. And the Sun launched their Jabs Army campaign on the 1st of January 2021, which was how can we get volunteers to help out at vaccination centres. And within 18 days, I think they'd signed up 60,000 people, which showed the convening power of the Sun, but also the trust that people had in the Sun, that they wanted to get involved, they wanted to help out. So I think all those things helped to build the narrative of how we approached it.
And in Brexit, is it the case that the Sun in Scotland, whatever it's called, Sun in Scotland was
Scottish
was a
Sun.
Remainer? Yeah,
Scottish
was a
Sun.
Remainer title compared to the one the rest of us got?
We,
Do you mould according to your readership?
our editors have the freedom to talk to the audiences that they serve. I edited both the Scottish Sun and the Sun in London, and we did approach things in different ways because they're different countries with different parliaments in many ways, different organisations, different cultures.
I do have some figures for you. I didn't want to give you misleading ones. So the circulation of The Guardian is around 100,000.
Okay.
And according to the PAMCO print and online metric that David just mentioned, we're at 24.6 million unique users. And in terms
It's
of...
going towards a pay model, is it? Because it kind of, or not, so they know who you are.
No, I don't think we...
I think it sort of says register here.
We look for subscribers, but we're very much not behind a paywall. That's not the way we have gone. And in terms of our coverage during the pandemic, I think the key thing was just explain. The best performing pieces, or some of them, were always the ones where we were posing questions to ourselves and then getting someone, one of our specialists, science editor or health editor, to answer them. There was just an absolute thirst for the kind of what's happening right now, so the devices of the live blogging that we have, which we've established over a number of years, were incredibly useful in that regard. But then the slightly more reflective pieces, how do we make sense of what we've just been told? The step back explainers, FAQs, things like that. There was a real thirst for those.
Also podcasts, you do quite a lot of them, don't
Yeah,
you?
we do those too, and that's another really good device for being able to. Sometimes a news story can seem quite brutal. You know, it's by its necessity. You know, it'll have a sharp top, and there's a kind of formula to a news story. Something like an explainer or a conversation that's had in something like Today in Focus allows you to be a bit more conversational.
And Brexit, not so much explaining, but opinion.
Well, no, there's lots of explaining in Brexit and lots of kind of context as well, because, you know, in both stories, people were saying things that needed to be interrogated, and you didn't want to leave. You didn't want to leave the news story on its own. You wanted to be able to step back, reflect on what was being said. Are we being told the truth? Are we being misled?
Thanks.
Thanks. Clive? Oh, sorry, Rupert. No,
Sorry.
Anything else from any of these two? Not.
Yeah, I mean, all I would say that, I mean, they're very, very different types of stories, and COVID was all about a thirst for information, and which is great in a way for journalists, because it's basic journalism. It's reporting fact, or trying to discern fact from fiction. I mean, we also, I mean, we ran a massive campaign to acquire equipment for the NHS, which readers engage with on a massive scale. So it was a very good sort of an exercise in both informing readers and empowering them.
Clive.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks for coming to give evidence to us today. So the Science Media Centre describes science and health reporters as allies in the fight against misinformation. So did you feel a duty to combat misinformation in the way that you reported during the pandemic? And how did you balance that between the need to get out public messages that were coming from the government, but also to be questioning of those public messages and providing scrutiny? So just I have three questions in one there to move us on a bit. But if I'll start with you, David, and then we'll do the same, go across.
So, I mean, I think we've touched on quite a lot of this already in terms of the messages that were coming out from science organisations. I think, like, if it's coming from a credible science organisation, that gives them a good start, but it's not a free pass to this information is 100% correct. And I think it is the job of journalists and news organisations to challenge around the fringes on this. I mean, let's face it, if we based our financial future on the consensus of economists, it probably wouldn't be the best way forward. And I think that I was struck. I was listening to Times Radio this morning, and there was Tom Whipple, our health editor, science editor, who played a big role in the pandemic coverage, was on there, and he was talking about editing genomes of gut bacteria, and I thought it was a classic case of science reporting. He using phrases like "there is a growing body of evidence," "it is linked to," "they are claims." The thing about science is we don't actually know exactly what is happening and how it is going to turn out. So I think when we are reporting these things, we are giving them credence, but there is always a big question mark at the end of the sentence, if that makes sense to you. And I think that's an important thing to understand in the role that the journalist plays in it.
But did the need to to provide a balanced range of information, to put it that way, during the pandemic, where people needed to understand what was going on, where there was clearly a need for public messaging to advise about lockdowns and accepting the vaccine, etc. Did that stay your hand at all in being the usual scrutiny that you would provide of a government?
No, as I say, I think there was so much work being done on so many different aspects of this story that, I mean, literally a stone wasn't unturned. So no, I don't think it did. I certainly wasn't aware of stories being pulled or that sort of thing. That's just not the case. And I think that as recent months have come to pass, there's not really much that's emerged that wasn't being, that has shown that we took the wrong decisions at the time.
I mean, the thing is, you can do both, can't you? You can report the news and then interrogate the news, and that's what we tried to do. And I don't think at any point during the pandemic did we ever decide we weren't going to run a story. We stuck the boot into Matt Hancock repeatedly. We highlighted what we regarded as concerns over VIP lanes and chumocracy and the scandals within the procurement of PPE. So I felt that we could do both, and certainly our science correspondents are among the most inquisitive, and in some ways untrusting of all our correspondents. They'll listen to one expert and then immediately get on the phone and want to talk to another one to challenge their opinion. So I felt we were in good hands, and I didn't feel that the need to report the news at any point prevented us from interrogating it or from highlighting scandals where we thought they existed.
Well, it probably won't come as any surprise that the Mirror was deeply sceptical of Boris Johnson's government at that point in many ways. And as Nick says, we looked at them in the way care homes were treated at that point. We did a huge amount of stories on that. PPE. There were a lot of issues that we were very, very strong on at that stage. But in terms of the science and in terms of the health messaging, we in the briefings we trusted Chris Whitty, we trusted Patrick Vallance, we trusted Jonathan Van Tam, and then because it wasn't just the daily briefings that we were getting, that people were seeing on the television, we were also getting off the record briefings from those people as well to our reporters. So there was a background and an understanding of what was going on. And then we absolutely interrogated that evidence, because I sort of think my role as an editor is to ask all the questions that people sitting at home are asking when they've watched something on the television at that night. So well, why are they saying that? How come last week the chief nurse was saying that we were going to go for herd immunity, and now we've all dropped the idea of herd immunity? And we put those questions in day after day, and we try to put in, using a range of experts and using all the information we're getting as well from sources such as Science Media Centre to try to really explain and reassure our readers as well, that because people want to understand. Because if they don't fully understand a problem, then they're never going to feel any sense of security. And at that point, a lot of our role was to try to create that sense of security. So you absolutely can do, as Nick said, you can provide that information, which gives people a sense of security, but you can also question a lot of the political decisions that were being made at that point.
Just on that bit about the private briefings that you had with the scientists that were we were seeing on the news every day. Looking back now, do you feel that they were full and frank, or that they were trying to manage the information at times?
Well, I mean,
there
has been some interesting things that have come out in the WhatsApp messages, haven't there, in the last fortnight, which perhaps did make me question last week if there were occasions when some of those scientists should have publicly said that they were unhappy, but I guess they too were in this situation whereby they felt that unity and putting on that front to the public was the best was the best idea. Certainly in terms of the scientific and health advice we were getting from them at the time, I think they were giving that to the best of their ability. Whether they had to compromise in some areas that were more around policy on things like lockdown, I guess that's for them.
I mean, I think we were sceptical about various aspects of the story, if it's the easiest way of encapsulating it, and this sort of happened as it went along, because when it started, we didn't know any more than anybody else about all this. We weren't in a position where we could possibly have said lockdown was the wrong policy when it was introduced, because we simply didn't have a body of knowledge about it. But there were things that were being done which one then started to be sceptical about, and I remember in the very early days the medical establishment invested an awful lot of hope in ventilators, and they were, and we did stories about entrepreneurs who were going to produce massive numbers of ventilators, and if we could find a way of building enough ventilators quickly and cheaply enough, this was going to be the solution. And we then began to hear that actually ventilators possibly were not saving people's lives, and we sent a reporter to New York where we interviewed a young doctor working in an intensive care ward in a New York hospital, and he explained to us why he thought they weren't the solution. And as far as I'm aware, ventilators are very rarely used in COVID cases now. So you sort of, to begin with, you begin, because this is all new, accepting what the medical establishment is accepting, and then as time goes along, you start finding dissenting voices, and you go and talk to them. And there were, the other question that we put effort into was the origins of COVID. Now, we still don't know for certain, but the possibility that it was a leak from the Institute of Virology in Wuhan was denounced as a conspiracy theory for a long time, to the point where Facebook and Twitter actually banned posts on the subject. When Joe Biden became president, he instructed the US government to look at it again, and last week the FBI said they think that is now the likely origin. We still don't know, but you do. I mean, I think sometimes you have to ask questions that people don't want you to ask, and there were certainly people in the medical establishment who didn't want to consider questions like that about how the virus began.
We're here discussing trusted voices, and I think people would question us if there was no mention of WhatsApp Gate at all at this committee this morning. So, with all your experience, have you ever experienced a time when a politician has become such a trusted source of information as Nick Hancock has over the last week?
Matt Hancock, yeah. I think Nick Hancock's the comedian. Maybe it's one and the same thing. It is a fascinating treasure trove of information on that period in history, isn't it? And I think one of the dangers that we actually face now, weirdly, with all the electronic communications, you speak to historians now and they're worried about how we will be able to tell history in the future, because there's not anything written down and things can get destroyed. So I think it is important that we do think about how these things are captured for the future.
Does it shed any light on the trusted voices that we were listening to during the COVID period? Do you think that makes us rethink how we should approach that in the future?
Yeah, but I mean, I do also think, getting back to the point around the chaos of the situation, if you are trying to run something, be it a business or a country or whatever, you should be asking yourselves questions internally as well. And then sometimes when those questions, I'm not saying that this doesn't excuse everything that's in the WhatsApp treasure trove, but sometimes when those questions do come out in the cold light of day with hindsight, they don't look particularly clever, but they're probably the right questions to be asking at the time to get to the right decision.
Anybody have any observations on WhatsApp Gate this week, in the light of what we've been discussing?
I mean, I've not seen anything in that makes me question what the chief medical officer or those people were instructing. I mean, they may have had, they may have compromised on some issues that they thought were perhaps for the national good. But I don't think in terms of the actual information they were giving, I haven't seen anything that makes me doubt that. I mean, obviously there's quite a lot that makes you doubt some of the political judgments that were being made. But I don't think, well, I mean, certainly from our perspective, I don't think the politicians were the trusted voices in the whole thing. It was the medical people, the health people, they were the trusted voices.
I've found the last week pretty depressing, I must say. I think people generally thought with each lockdown that they were doing it for absolutely 100% medical reasons, and we now know that the medical science was at best uncertain, particularly as time went on, and that it was being done for political reasons because the government wanted to show it was doing something. So I think, if we're talking about trust, it's worrying, and I don't know about others, but in another situation, a similar situation in the future, maybe avian bird flu, and the government starts wanting to impose patterns of behaviour on people which are going to disrupt their lives, people are going to be more questioning, inevitably. There can't be another consequence of what we've learned over the last week, I don't think.
One of the surprises is, this sort of government by WhatsApp. I think even that's taken us by surprise that so many conversations were being had, and frankly, there is as petty, and the language is so petty in the conversations. I think is that's one surprise. I mean, the other thing I would say though is that it's a great scoop from the Telegraph, but what I don't think it does is provide any context, and this is something we've tried to do at The Guardian, which is at each of the points where there were these discussions going on, there's not, as far as I can see, that much reflection on what the country was going through at that particular time, the number of people who were in hospital, the stretch there was on the NHS, the number of people who were dying, that's where I sort of feel that we have a job to do to try and explain a little bit more and remind people about what was going on at the time.
Yeah, pressures in schools as well.
And also, I suppose it's difficult. We've got to have within this conversation as well, amongst those, the politicians and the supposed trusted voices. We also now know that there was a huge amount of rule breaking going on, and that does lie at the heart of it, really, in that. That's going to cause a breakdown of trust between the public and the supposed trusted voices. And with The Guardian, we ran the exclusive with the Dominic Cummings and Barnard Castle and all that story, which was back in the May of 2020. And I remember thinking really long and hard when we ran that story, because I felt a huge level of responsibility. What if running this story destroys trust to such an extent that the public health message completely breaks down, and then people stop abiding by the lockdown rules. And I felt a personal weight of responsibility at that point, but we also obviously felt the overwhelming need that was in the public interest, that needs to be out there. But I think sometimes journalists were more concerned about the importance of trust than perhaps some of the people who were making the policy.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Simon Joe.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning. One of the things that I've noticed about journalism is that it's one of the 5 least trusted professions in the country now. I dare add that I think politicians are trusted less. So it's important to caveat that as you're sitting in front of a bunch of politicians. What accounts, do you think, for low levels of trust in journalists? David, if I can come to you first.
I like the way that I've started them all.
It's just because I always go in that direction. Left to right.
So, look, I think we are, we are big organisations. We're big public organisations in the way that, as well, MPs are part of a big public organisation as well, and therefore, it is easy for people to have an opinion of it. I think the statistics around trust in news brands are slightly different, and when people are surveyed, they actually put, whether it's print or online, they put a lot of trust in what they actually read. So I think there's a difference between do you trust journalists and do you trust what their actual output is. And I think that's an important
that does bear fruit in the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism. They did a report, and brand trust scores were heavily variable depending on the brand and depending on the publisher, all that kind of stuff. Nick, the same question to you. Why do you think that some people have a low level of trust with journalists?
Well, there have been scandals over the years that have painted journalists not in terrifically positive light. The phone hacking scandal is obviously the main one. But as David says, actually, I think there is a difference between journalists and journalistic brands, and I'm not saying The Guardian doesn't have a problem. We have to be mindful of misinformation, and we do our very best to ensure that we don't publish wrong stories and incorrect stories. But from what I can see of the studies that have been done, for instance, on our coverage of COVID and our coverage of the environment, we're a very highly trusted news brand, and we really value and cherish that.
Alison?
I think it might be slightly more nuanced than just different brands have different levels of trust. I think it's the relationship between a reader and that brand. So somebody who says, I may not trust journalists, but then if they're a Mirror reader, I really trust the Mirror. I've been reading the Mirror for 20 years. I know all the writers, I know the columnists, because you've got a relationship, and I'm sure it's exactly the same for the Sun. People who buy the Sun will trust the Sun, but they may not necessarily trust other brands or journalists generally. For example, I imagine lots of people say, oh no, I don't trust politicians. Okay, do you trust your own constituency MP? Oh yeah, he's a really nice bloke. It's that. So if you've got a relationship with somebody, it's different to sort of journalists in the broad brushstroke. So I think it's that, and I think I think there is data as well that shows that our trust scores as an industry did go up following COVID as well, because I think we were so out there not just telling the news, we were explaining the news. And maybe we just need to do more of that.
Peter?
Yeah, I'm familiar with the Reuters research. There's also some recently published Ofcom research which shows that print newspapers are very close in trust to TV, and at a high level, 71% for TV, 67% for print. Social media, 35%. Now, I was at a Ofcom conference last week where the Reuters Institute produced some fascinating survey research on young people's consumption of news, 18 to 25-year-olds. And they told us that of the people they surveyed, only 25% had actually accessed news from a traditional provider, whether TV or newspaper, in the last month. 75% hadn't at all. And when they were asked where they got their news from, they said social media. When they were asked what does that mean, TikTok, Snapchat and Facebook. And what they were actually consuming and calling news was posts by influencers and celebrities.
Doesn't this scare you? I mean,
Yes.
for me as a former journalist, I didn't say at the top of this because I was a broadcast journalist as opposed to a print journalist working for the BBC and ITV. Doesn't it scare you that is a growing trend? And I think we all saw it during the pandemic. We saw the avalanche of new community groups on social media sites as well. So moving away from TikTok, I don't go on TikTok. I think it's utterly baffling. I'm only 37, but but don't you think this is a really worrying trend? Because trust in journalism, proper rigorous journalism, is really important because people get their news and it's fair and it can be balanced and everything else like that. Obviously, arguments of bias either way on all different kinds of publications. But if young people are accessing news in that way and not going to even, the sort of news that's developed specifically for them, Radio 1, Newsbeat, whatever it might be, are you facing extinction?
No, it's our responsibility to go to where the audience are. I mean, audiences have always evolved and changed. And there are news organisations that are going to survive have got to evolve, and we've got to. That's why probably all the people around the table are investing in Snapchat and TikTok. We've got to go to where the audience is, and we've got to ensure that we are creating trusted news that they want to access.
It's so different. So, having been a Snapchat user many years ago when it wasn't even particularly trendy, and other websites as well. Now these are snippets of like clips and news. You can't really contextualise a proper story in that, can you? So are we cheapening news by using these platforms?
No, because I think it's different because people change, they grow up, through their life they want different things from their news as well. So it's not a one solution fits all. I'm sure, to be honest, you could have sat here 30 years ago and bemoaned young people, or they're not interested in the world around them. That's always been, but people...
Not saying that, by the way. I'm still relatively young myself.
But I think things adapt, and it's as people become more invested in society, their children go to school, they use public services, that they become more aware of the society around them, and therefore they've got more investment in understanding the world around them and trying to make sense of it. So I think the onus is on us to tailor our news to the different audiences.
I hope you're right, Alison. I hope you're right.
I have to say, it's not without challenge.
No.
But we have to keep fighting.
Absolutely. If I can, I'd like to draw a comparison between national newspapers and local newspapers. Now, we know that local journalism has really struggled in recent years. Local newspapers have closed. The staffing levels within local newspapers has diminished somewhat. There is work being done through the Local Democracy Reporting Service to try and strengthen local reporting of council stuff that goes on. And I've sat in council meetings, and most of which weren't particularly enjoyable. But there were news snippets out of it. But they are trusted. Local journalists, local papers are trusted more than national brands. Is that because there's a perception that journalists could live in their street? David?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's back to that point of who you know, who you've got the connection with, who you've got who is in your community. So I think it probably is from that. The difficulty now is with the challenges that local newspapers are facing is that they may well not have somebody in that community. And I think they are the canary in the coal mine for news in general, and that more and more sort of local community news is provided by untrained sources that you don't know whether anything's been checked out.
If I may, can I use an example? So yeah. There was an online news site in my county of Devon a couple of years ago, which just allowed councils and the police to upload press releases that will then be turned into news stories. I mean, that's pretty bad, isn't it?
Yes.
That's not journalism.
No,
that is
it is absolutely
journalism.
not. Well, it's a wall on which you stick your poster, basically. Yeah. It's absolutely not journalism. So, as I say, canary in the coal mine. It is something we need to sort out. We need to find new models for this. I mean, just if I could go back on the other point of what happens to national newspapers and news in general, the important thing to remember is that there's only one group creating the raw material, and that is professional news providers, trusted raw material. Everything else is feeding off that. And when you get into these platforms, actually Snapchat I think is not a good example because they do have brand specific channels that you go into. But on TikTok and so on, which is just a flick through, the brand blindness that you get there, you've no idea where it's coming from. People will say they get their news from Facebook, but actually they're clicking or they're seeing it from the sun or the mirror or whatever. And then you take the next evolution of this, which is into artificial intelligence and ChatGPT. If we start off with, a Google search term which provides you a load of answers where you can see what the source is, and then you move to the other extreme, which is ChatGPT, where you put in your question and you're provided with an answer where you've no idea where it's come from, no idea whether it's true, but you can guarantee that it has scraped our content somewhere along the way to come up with that answer.
Yeah. Could it also be, and I'll come to Nick for this particular point, if I may, that with local journalism there can be less of a groupthink mentality? We know that in Westminster you have the lobby, and they have briefings and all that kind of stuff. It's quite a closed shop. Do you think that that can be detrimental as well as beneficial to those publishers who are part of it?
Well, I think it comes back to the different relationship there is between. I started on a weekly newspaper and then an evening newspaper, and I well remember the relationship between the readers and us as reporters was very different to the national scenario. It was quite intimate. They turned up in our, in our offices, and they had access to us at council meetings. It was a much more personal and intimate relationship than there is probably with national readers. Of course, local press has been withering for all the reasons we know, and that's a real problem for us, and it's a real problem to the sort of the ecology of news. Not least because we don't tend to. It's very difficult for journalists now to get into national newspapers. There's not the route that I went. 2 weekly newspapers, an evening newspaper. That's a much more perilous route now than it ever used to be.
Salaries are low. People can't afford to
low,
continue to do it. They go and work in, funnily enough, PR after a short period. But going back to my point, particularly about regional versus national. Is groupthink, can that be a problem?
I think groupthink's a problem at The Guardian.
Maybe not The Guardian. Alison.
Or the Mail.
No, I don't really think that's one of the big issues that we face at all. Certainly within the lobby there's all sorts of different perspectives, and within every newsroom, really.
I guess my point is, wouldn't it be great if that was opened up to a more regional strategy, so you had more people from the regions that could come and be part of those briefings and everything else? We saw that during the pandemic.
Yeah, we did.
I thought it was really
some of the regional titles do obviously have people here, but I think as we've discussed, it's a real challenge in the regional press at the moment.
But the plurality of our national news brands is something to be cherished. For exactly that reason, that we don't have groupthink. There are, the wonderful thing I think about newspapers in the UK is that there are biases, and that you do know where it's coming from, and that's what avoids that groupthink. I can't say it's quite the same as sports reporters, slightly different.
Peter,
but certainly.
A couple of observations. And I worked in local papers as well, and with a local paper, you have a direct connection with the news. There was a big plume of smoke over on the other side of town last night, and the next day you read the paper and there's the explanation, and then you go to work and you can see the burnt out buildings, so it's happened. If you choose to be untrusting, you see the same report in a national paper, you've got no way of checking it yourself. But I am deeply worried about the lack of on-the-ground reporting by local papers these days. And for my sins, for some years I sat on the complaints committee at IPSO, and a growing category of complaints is people complaining about court cases that have been reported in the local paper, and you discover they've been reported from a police press release. Now, the police are not a neutral party in a criminal court case, whereas the local paper reporter is. I think that's deeply worrying. The other thing that's happened to a lot of local papers is they've vastly increased the amount of centrally produced content because it's cheaper. So, local. It's deeply concerning that local paper reporting is at such a low ebb.
Chair.
Thank you. Before I move to Kevin, can I just thank Alison for using exactly the same point about how readers trust their own newspapers more than they trust newspapers generally, as all politicians' news, that MPs are more trusted by their own constituents than by others. This is a rare moment of harmony between politicians and journalists, which I feel we should note. Kevin.
Thank you, Chair. It's funny, Alison, you should talk about the brands or the Daily Mirror as a club, because I remember being a member of the Daily Mirror Pop Club when I was a teenager, which helped me to acquire tickets to see Bob Marley and the Wailers in Cardiff. So I have very fond memories of being a member of the Daily Mirror Pop Club. But I wondered, what's the process? We're talking about trust and so on. What's the process by which you seek to verify a story? When something comes your way. Shall I ask you first, Alison, since we're...
Yes. So, a reporter, I don't know how much detail you want on this, but so if a reporter will come in and they'll talk to their news editor, probably the deputy news editor will be involved in a conversation if it's a big story. They will discuss what the story is. Okay, have you managed to get a second source on that? Have you managed to get a third source on that? Because depending on the scale of the story and the possible ramifications, we'll want 2 or 3 sources. Then that will go to the lawyer. There'll then be a conversation with the lawyer, or the copy will go to the lawyer if it's written, who will sort of go through any possible legal issues. Then it will get listed in conference, at which point I'll ask about 1 million really annoying questions, which just drives the news editor up the wall. So we just check that we're all bottomed out on the facts. It would then be discussed later on in the day. If it's appearing in the print edition, it would then go through the backbench, so the night editor. It then goes through the middle bench, which is the chief subs. It then goes to the sub. It then goes back to the middle bench. It then goes through the lawyer again, and then it will appear in print. So it's a pretty robust system.
And would it be fair to say that's the same system that pretty much everybody would follow in your, organisations? Is there any, if there's not a dissenting voice from that or a different process, then...
Dissenting voice is a really interesting point as well. So when it's discussed in conference, which is a really great opportunity, similar to this, lots of people sat around a table, and if somebody says, I don't know, that doesn't sound right to me. So there's lots of opportunities for the problems to be flushed out.
Do you ever go ahead with a story when you've got a single source? And would there be circumstances that might happen?
In that scenario, what you will do is you'll put, I've missed a bit out, which is that also when you've got the story, you then go to the person who's impacted by the story and say, right, these are the allegations, what is your response? So if they come back with a flat denial, that's not true, then we go back to the drawing board. If it's, they make some quote or statement so they're not absolutely denying it, but you've given them the opportunity to deny it, but they're trying to sort of flim-flam around it, then we would run it in that scenario.
What about if they ignore you?
If they ignore us, it's much more difficult. Yeah. And then it depends. If we would probably go back several times, and if we think they're deliberately ignoring us, then that's...
I want to go back to this business of the WhatsApps and the stories this week and so on, because I take it, David, from what you said, that it was a great scoop for the Telegraph, that had Isabel Oakeshott brought you this story, that your titles would have been likely to publish that. Is that a fair assumption?
I think you need to ask the editors.
Let's ask you in a different way then. I mean, as someone who's been an editor yourself and as a journalist and so on, would you, if you'd been approached and you were in charge of a national title, take on that kind of story?
It's very difficult not to give great consideration to a story of such merit.
If Isabel Oakeshott had come to The Guardian, might sound a far-fetched idea, but and with
It'd be a story in itself.
With these, what would your reaction have been?
Well, I think we would have considered it. We'd have looked at the material on its merits. I think we would have probably, if we were going to publish it, we'd have probably done it in a slightly different way.
What would be different about the way the Guardian would have done it?
Well, I think that I think that putting Isabel Oakeshott so front and centre of it was problematic, because it would have been for us anyway, because Isabel has a view about lockdown, as does the Telegraph, and we would be very careful, I think, to intermingle with a news story commentary in the way that the Telegraph has, and we know why the Telegraph has done it in this way. It's just we would have done it. I'm not criticising the Telegraph for the way they've done it. I'm just saying we'd have done it differently.
Okay, Alison, would the Mirror have published it?
Yes, I mean, the Telegraph and Isabel Oakeshott do have an anti-lockdown agenda. We didn't. We were erred on the side of caution in terms of the lockdowns. However, I do think those WhatsApp messages are in the public interest, and we would have used them.
Okay, and Peter, do you have a view?
Yes, I agree with Alison. I think they were very much in the public interest. We don't really know the exact nature of this non-disclosure agreement, which you would have wanted to see. But I'm afraid it gives a unique insight into the way government works and how the government handled the pandemic. I wouldn't like to be in the position of having turned it away.
Do you have any qualms at all as journalists regarding the ethics? And I understand the argument about the public interest and you'll run it past lawyers given the NDA and so on, but any qualms at all ethically as journalists about a journalist, signing a non-disclosure agreement with somebody who was writing a book in exchange for having access to very, very personal details? I mean, I'm not sure I know anyone who'd like all their WhatsApp messages to be put all over the front page of the Daily Telegraph, even if they are highly reputable individuals. But do you have any qualms about it at all? And I suppose in terms of our inquiry, does it in any way undermine trust in journalists that actually it doesn't matter what they say to you, at the end of the day, if it's a good story, you're screwed?
Well, first of all, there were aspects of it that I would have had qualms about, and one is publishing Matt Hancock's WhatsApps may be one thing, because he had given them to Isabel Oakeshott to write a book with the intention of him being painted in a heroic light. So there seems to me to be a pretty strong public interest in knowing the truth about what he was saying. I did feel for Helen Whately, I think it was, the junior minister, because they published everybody else's WhatsApps as well. And I would be fascinated to hear what people like Helen Whately or Simon Case or other people involved think about this. I mean, I can illustrate this by a story from my own time as editor, which also involves Isabel Oakeshott, and we were approached through an intermediary by Vicky Price, the wife of Chris Hoon, about her allegations about her taking his speeding points. She quite understandably didn't want to go to prison, and we spent weeks on the Mail on Sunday with lawyers trying to find a way of doing this that wouldn't end up with her being prosecuted. She got impatient, went to Isabel Oakeshott, and Isabel Oakeshott, then working for the Sunday Times, published the next week, and Vicky Price went to prison.
She did indeed. I knew her when she was economist, when I was a minister in the business department. She was our chief economist at the time.
But I lost the story.
Yeah.
So there we go.
I mean,
I can't answer that one.
Any qualms, any of the rest of you, ethically about this?
I think there are qualms about other people's text messages, but the WhatsApps. But I think you could probably have done the story in such a way that you didn't necessarily have to use all of those. But I think there is a public interest justification for journalism, and I think that in this situation that's okay.
So you don't think it undermines trust in journalists, that what this whole episode?
I think this is quite a specific episode in that you've got a very high-profile politician in the biggest story of our generation giving his WhatsApp messages to a very high-profile journalist. So I think there are other things that you could say cause distrust in journalists. I don't think this is one of them.
This is just what happens when a conceited fool gives their WhatsApp messages to a devious scribbler, basically. Is that what you're saying?
That's what you just said.
David?
You could say that, I can't comment.
Yeah, I mean, I take a similar view. I mean, somebody texted me last week and said, is this a breach of confidentiality? And I said, it's probably a breach of confidence, more than that. And I think that there is a difference there. He, as Peter said, he used this WhatsApp trove to write the book, and now you've seen the rest of the context. I don't think there's much of a complaint on his part, apart from with the person who'd made the agreement with. But I think there is a strong public interest. And then the other aspect is, if you're in public life, be careful what you're committing to communication, which again is challenging, and I think we all have to navigate our way through that.
Just on briefly. Sorry.
Claire, I think
It was just on. It was just following on from what my colleague has just been asking questions about, which is about Elizabeth Oakeshott authoring that book for and ghostwriting that book. I mean, is that given what you've seen of what's in the WhatsApps? Do you think that book should be rewritten? Is it a trusted source of information? And as a journalist,
Probably
would you
not
have
the
written
full
it?
story, is it?
Pardon?
But it's not the full story. But I guess most people's autobiographies aren't necessarily the full story of their life. They're their life as they perceive it.
The journalist wrote it, Ghost wrote it, in full possession of all those WhatsApps. I mean, and we can now see what was written, compare what was written, what we now know.
I mean, you'd have to get into what the arrangement was around ghostwriting a book. Ordinarily, a ghostwriter uses all the information, and then the actual person who should have been writing the book in the first place edits it so that they feel that's... so I don't know that you could necessarily blame the journalist in that scenario. It's the person whose name's on the front cover.
You could probably call it Matt Hancock, my version of events.
Yes.
Yeah, it was a reconstructed diary after the facts, wasn't it? You know, but can I just ask one other issue briefly, Chair, and that is, on the legacy of Leveson and hacking and so on. How much damage did that do to your organisations, or to trust in journalism and newspapers and media organisations? And is there still a legacy of it? I mean, are you still facing challenges about it? And has the response from the industry post Leveson actually worked? I mean, just thoughts on that. And I will start with you this time, David.
So obviously, I mean, our organisation has been through a huge amount of turmoil as a result of it. The News of the World, as you know, closed as a result of it. We have the industry as a whole is almost unrecognisable from what it was a decade ago, in the way that it operates and it's the way that it goes about its business. And I have every confidence in the way that certainly our titles and the evidence I see from other papers that we conduct our business in a fit and proper fashion. And I think it's really important to understand, when Alison was talking about how we go about verifying a story, we as news brands, we train journalists, we pay journalists, we bring in lawyers, we pay lawyers. We have an editor's code of conduct, which, if you haven't read it, I would implore you to do so, because I think it's an excellent document and an excellent guide, which when I was editing newspapers I certainly lived by, and I'm sure my colleagues do the same. That's just pre-publication. Post-publication, you have the right of redress. You can go to the title itself. You can go to IPSO. You can go to the courts. There are many ways in which you can deal with complaints to newspapers that you just have no chance with in social media.
I don't want to go into it because I think John Nicholson might ask a question about that later. But so what you're saying in essence is we've completely changed our practices as a result of that scandal, and that what's remaining, there are some legacy cases I think still going through the courts that we can't talk about because they're sub judice presumably, but that's the position we're in currently. Is that a fair assessment of the situation? And does anybody want to add anything to that from the perspective of your own organisations, how it's impacted and whether it's still impacting upon you?
I think really just as David said, I just think everything has changed. Everything has changed, and the way we operate is entirely different, and that's a good thing. And we are sort of on that kind of process of trying to rebuild trust.
The Guardian broke the story, as you know, but that doesn't mean that we felt that we were excused from or exempt from examining our own processes. And we have this reader's editor that we've had now for 25 years, and that's been a sort of fantastic recourse for people who have a complaint against our journalism. And it's something that Catherine Viner, our editor-in-chief, has emphasised time and again since she was editor, is that we can't assume trust. We have to earn it.
Okay. And final question to you, Peter. What do you think of this development of things like Talk TV and GB News and so on, and what implications it has for your organisations?
For my organisation?
Well, for organisations traditionally printed newspapers and have operated under different rules than broadcast media, and what's happening in that space now. Is it a good development? Is it a concerning development?
I mean, I'm afraid I'm not a consumer of GB News or Talk TV. I mean, the sort of informal state of play which developed over the years once television came on the scene was that television operated under state licence, and the trade-off was that it had state regulation, and that part of that regulation was a requirement for impartiality. And certainly going back decades, that sort of was reasonably true of BBC and ITV. And newspapers, when I came into newspapers, I was told I was an idiot because newspapers were dead. This was 1974, because we couldn't compete with TV. Well, we did. And that arrangement left the field for newspapers to provide comment and opinion, and to campaign and to take up causes in a way that TV found much more difficult. Now, I can't pretend to know, David will know better than me, how Ofcom is applying impartiality rules to GB News and Talk TV. And again, David will know the size of their audiences. They don't seem to me to be vast. But if television had a free hand with opinion and didn't have to obey impartiality rules, then I presume life for newspapers would get more difficult.
I'm not going to hog any more time. I'll hand back to you, Chair. And
Giles,
Thank you, Chair. First of all, Alison, to give David a break from being first on the list, you said earlier that medical people were the trusted voices during the pandemic, but then there was a big campaign on social media who said that they weren't to be trusted, and even poor Chris Whitty was physically attacked as a result of some of that campaigning. Shouldn't you, as mainstream media, and this is really for all of you, but Alison first of all, feel a responsibility to push back against such campaigns, or do you just report on them?
Well, I mean, I think we did push back. I think we all pushed back, but not in a. You've got to explain the news to people. You can't just batter them over the head with it. Our responsibility is to explain, and that's why we try to focus on the importance of good information and to give people the sort of information that they needed, so that if you imagine you're at work and you're having an argument with somebody who's just got all their information off of a WhatsApp group or off of a posting that they've seen, you've got to give them the ability to fight back, say, no, because I read in the Mirror this, that and the other thing. So that's how we do it. There is no point in anybody just going out there and yelling at people that they're stupid and they're thick, because that does not change people's minds.
And also that might make them become even more entrenched, I suppose.
Yeah, and I don't know how much of that, I mean, I guess you're looking at it, how much of that misinformation you were seeing. Interestingly, because of private WhatsApp groups I was in, because of my children's sport and things like that, I was seeing all these WhatsApp messages coming in. And it'd be things like, oh, another footballer's just collapsed because of having had the jab. And so that's, when we talk about trusted news, people trust people they know. So if one of the dads in your kids' football team said, oh, that's how you have that relationship of trust, because it's somebody that you know. So the media obviously is that bit apart, and that's why we have to have those relationships with our readers, that they feel that we're like friends who are telling them some good information.
Yeah, so this committee has in a previous incarnation taken evidence on how social media gives a big voice to small and perhaps extreme and often uninformed opinions. And that can be a very dangerous thing. And so do we look to you, the mainstream media, to make sure you're giving that voice of truth, but how do you make sure, I know you've covered it to a certain extent, how do you ensure that you can get that message through to those people who are getting their news from their trusted source, which is their person they know, who has been misinformed by social media, if you see what I mean?
Well, I remember we certainly,
Peter, yeah,
when people were attacking 5G phone masts, we certainly did a number of exposés on the people behind these crazy theories and debunking them. But I mean, it's worth doing when something is actually causing clear damage. You're always aware of the risk that by giving someone publicity, even if it's negative publicity, there are going to be people who believe it. It's not easy.
No, there is that thing, of course, that you mustn't give them oxygen, so don't comment, I suppose.
Well, also, you've only got limited resources, and really they should be devoted to covering events that have actually happened, and, science that is science, not bogus science.
Absolutely.
But there comes a point where you do need to debunk it.
Yeah, this one's for Nick, really. Do you think there's a responsibility on newspapers such as The Guardian to spread calm amongst the panic? We've got to look through it of the lens of the time. We didn't know what was coming. We've iterated that today. And the government, the scientists were literally feeling their way because we didn't know what was happening. And it would be easy on social media to spread panic. Or was there a temptation in the media, and I'm not accusing any publication represented here, to trade on the sort of the penny dreadful side of things, because horror and shock is much more interesting?
I don't think so. I mean, I think that we took a view all the way through the pandemic that we would, as I said in answer to previous questions, we would try and wrap around our news stories context and analysis and FAQs and devices such as that, which would allow our journalists to, hopefully in an honest and transparent way, explain the state of knowledge at that particular moment in time, what we knew and what we didn't know. And as I said earlier, those kinds of pieces were the ones that really did fantastically well during the pandemic. People wanted to be told in as much detail as we could, in as accessible way as we possibly could, what was going on at any given moment.
Well, that's encouraging. So you didn't feel like you were shouting at a wall of blankness, nobody listening. They were listening to social media instead.
No, I mean, as the other panelists have said, I mean, there is a big problem, wider problem, which is our hopefully trusted news online can be mingled with misinformation. But in terms of, our job is just to make sure that the material we produce is as honest and trustworthy as possible, and go to those places like TikTok. We do stuff on TikTok now, and even if the readers, the people who use TikTok are not necessarily Guardian readers now, by going into that community, the gravitational pull, hopefully, of our journalism will bring them towards us.
Very helpful. You've touched on something I want to ask next. Your editorial code at The Guardian states that trust in the authenticity and reliability of our sources is essential. And it's those very sources I wanted to ask about. And I will move along the board, but initially to Nick again. Do your newspapers put more weight on anonymous sources or those who are willing to be identified?
Well, the code states that we mustn't use anonymous sources lazily or indiscriminately, I think is the words that we use. Do we use anonymous sources? Yes, we do. But we would take using anonymous sources on a kind of case-by-case basis. And also, to a degree, it depends on the journalist who's offering the story. If someone like Pippa Crerar, who Alison knows very well, tells us she has an anonymous source in Whitehall who is telling her something, Pippa has fantastic reach into the corridors of power. So we would listen to her. It wouldn't mean that we wouldn't interrogate her on it. If a more junior reporter is offering a story based on an anonymous source, then we would probably question them under caution to find out a little bit more.
Yeah, it's. I'm sure that every politician in the room has been asked by a journalist to give a quote off the record, and that's probably where some of these sources come from. But do you think that the use of anonymous sources might lower the trust in journalism?
Well, obviously you don't want to use anonymous sources unless you really have to. You want to be able to put a name and a title and a responsibility to the source that you're quoting. That is not always possible. So, ideally we wouldn't have to use them, but there are circumstances in which we do. And fundamentally, if a story is right, it's right. And if we use an anonymous source, and we, as Alison has said, we go to somebody for a right of reply, and in that right of reply it becomes very clear that whatever the source has told us is correct, then that shouldn't diminish the credibility of that kind of story.
Okay, any other comments on this? No? Okay, fair enough. So, I'll ask one more question. So, we all recall, I'm sure, David Sullivan's publication, Sunday Sport, Daily Sport, and the general public knew that fundamentally what was published there was rubbish. Elvis had been found on the dark side of the moon, Hitler was somewhere, or whatever it was, and we all knew it was rubbish, and quite rightly poo-pooed it as the precursor to social media stories. How much damage do you think that did? Because that was a paper publication.
So was the Beano. I mean, I don't know whether that did that much.
Exactly. But people did believe it.
Did they?
I don't think anybody believed. I think it was pure entertainment. Yeah.
Well, okay, fair enough.
But I think he never sold very many copies. No, fair enough.
I think the important thing to remember is that people, and again the stats bear this out, that most people, when they read something on social media, they will then go and check it in a reputable news source. And I think we still play a really important role in that sort of verification process. Back in the Sunday Sport days, you described that as an urban myth, and as editors of papers we could just ignore it. Now there's such a low barrier to entry to the distribution of information these things take on a life of their own. So it may be, and when we move into the world of deep fakes, which is on us now, and state-sponsored disinformation, it may be that we do need to start showing why we are not running stories. And these are the reasons why they are not true.
And again, you bring me neatly onto my next question. On what basis do you decide whether to publish stories about misinformation and disinformation?
I have a good example of this. And at Christmas, I was with a friend who I'm not going to embarrass by identifying her, but she has a senior public affairs role at a multinational company. And we were talking about the Zelenskys and Mrs. Zelensky in particular. And she said, well, it was such a shame that she went and spent $40,000 on a handbag and shoe spree in Paris. And I literally felt the bottom fall out of my stomach. And I went, this is horrific. And I thought, but it can't be true. And I went home and I investigated it. And the first hit on Google was a Newsweek debunking of this story, which had emanated from the Sunderland Global Media. One employee, Anna Pavlova. So, that is a good example of
It got traction.
When it did get traction. Yeah, it got traction all over France, all over the States, to the point where it had to be debunked. And I think that's the point. We can't be the policeman of the internet,
No.
but we can be a source of trust.
Do you have any concerns that actually covering these sort of stories actually gives them some credence?
No, I think in cases like that where you're able to go, there is no evidence to support this whatsoever. I think that is important. Okay. And in the deep fake thing as well, where you'll have a video of something going around Twitter, if you're able to say this is categorically not true and that's coming from one of our organisations, then that will really help.
Is there any liaison between the organisations, the news organisations on this? If something comes along that is damage, you speak to each other, do you?
Not
on a story-by-story basis.
I mean, reporters may do.
Right. It's informal.
It'd be informal, yes. It wouldn't be appropriate to be discussing what stories we're doing.
No, quite. I understand. Okay, thank you. No, thank you, Chair.
Thank you. All I would say is that if you look at any MP's email inbox, the idea that everyone goes away and checks with a reputable news source before they get convinced by something they've read online, I'm afraid that's not true. But I agree we may get a skewed section of the population. John Nicholson.
Thank you very much. Yes, on that, I'm just looking here at a story that just popped up from the Herald on Sunday, and it is Kate Forbes, who's one of the candidates for the SNP leadership, with a Bible photoshopped into her hand. That can't be right. Okay? Front page, she wasn't holding a Bible, she was just standing like that, and they've photoshopped a Bible into her hand because she has some controversial religious views. Can I start off with you, Peter? I was interested that you talked about the straightforward coverage that Metro got. And by some metrics, local papers have higher trust levels, don't they, than some of the nationals. What do you think the nationals have got to learn from local coverage, straightforward coverage, as you described it?
Well, I mean, as I said earlier, I think one of the reasons why locals have higher trust levels is simply that you can observe for yourself what they've reported, which you can't do with national papers. The way the newspaper market has evolved in Britain has meant that, unlike in the US or in France or Germany, where most titles are defined geographically under local monopolies, the national newspaper market in Britain has divided demographically and politically.
That may be the key. People feel with local papers that they're not being spun a line, that stories aren't being filtered by the newspaper's politics, and that in fact they're being told news, the truth, rather than political spin.
It's not so much the truth, and local paper, a matter of the truth, and local papers do run leaders, or they certainly did in my day, and they do run campaigns, and they do take political positions, and I mean, I think all our titles took a position one way or another over Brexit. Metro didn't, but the Daily Mail was in favour of Brexit, Mail on Sunday was against, and, you know, everybody took a position, and readers expect a position.
To reinforce their own prejudices.
Well, readers, I mean, opinions are valuable. I mean, people want to know facts, but they understand that you also want to know opinions. You don't just want to be told that the economy's in a nosedive, you know, the cost of living's gone up 12% in the last month. You want to know why that's happened, which will be 50% opinion, because there'll be different theories. And you want to know what could be done about it. And that inevitably is going to be opinion. I mean, economists will all give you different answers.
Yeah, I think they'll mostly pretty much agree that Brexit's been pretty disastrous. That's what the OBR says. But
well, that's your opinion.
Well, that's what the OBR says, and I'm not responsible for what the OBR says. I've asked people online to tell me what questions they would like asked. I'm very keen on whistleblowers, actually, and I quite often encourage them to write to me here, and you get some fantastic stuff. You've got to filter it very carefully, of course, to make sure that people are really who they imply that they are. One of the questions I've been asked quite a lot is what responsibility you as newspapers have to promote trusted voices. In other words, how engaged are you in making sure that what you say is true? Alison?
Well, we aim to ensure that everything we print is true.
I was fascinated by your description, 3 layers of editorial oversight. I think you
imagine it's probably more than 3 by the time you've gone through all those different sets of eyes. I mean, mistakes happen. We try to avoid mistakes happening.
What was the last big mistake you made?
Gosh, I think we've been all right for a few months, but I mean, we do. But mistakes will happen in any organisation. So our role is to. But in terms of actual premeditated attempts to mislead people, there's absolutely none of that. And in terms of trusted voices, we have many voices, both in terms of people doing sort of straight news and also opinion writers, who our readers trust. Now, you may not, or other people may not agree with what they say, and so therefore they're perhaps less likely to trust those people, but our readers trust them, and that's why they're there. And I think, going back to your point about local news, why do people feel that local news is more trustworthy? Quite often I think that might be because you're less likely to read something in a local paper or a local website that you disagree with. And I think if you go into that whole situation about polarisation within our society, there is a tendency now that if people don't agree with a particular viewpoint, they find it untrustworthy. And I think if you're unpicking this whole issue, you need to have a look at that.
That's social media that's done that.
I think we, as a society, Brexit had a huge impact on us. I think social media, I think the way the algorithms work, I think are such that it's easier to sow dissent than it is to sow issues that bring people back together. I think that the social media algorithms are a huge issue in this. I
love newspapers, and I pick up a pile from The Sun to The Guardian. I like to hold newspapers, and I'm interested. That's a generational thing, which is probably a little bit sad. But I like to read them online as well. Can I perhaps turn, Nick, to talk to you, which is something else a lot of people have asked me about, which is about corrections. Now, I know you've not signed up for IPSO. Maybe we can explain to people that there are 2 regulators. There's the one that the industry wanted, which is IPSO, and then there's another one which is independent. And there wasn't really delivered after Levinson what politicians promised at the time was there. But IPSO only upholds a tiny number of complaints. Am I right?
You might well be, but we're not a member of IPSO.
I know.
We have our own separate checks and balances system.
Decide not to join IPSO.
Well, I mean, this is all quite historic arguments, but
If you could just remember, this is for lay people to watch
think,
and listen to. So if you could explain it quite
I think
simply.
after Leveson, my recollection is that we thought that IPSO was a slightly better, but still quite similar to the Press Complaints Commission. And so it really wasn't our cup of tea. I don't think our view has changed since then. And as I recall, Leveson praised the checks and balances system that The Guardian had at the time, which have been reinforced since then with the reader's editor role, which we've had for a long time now. So we've ended up in the position we're in, and we're comfortable with it. And certainly from what surveys that have been done, we're regarded as a trusted news source.
What would you need IPSO to do to persuade you to join IPSO?
As head of news, it's not a subject that I sort of grapple with day to day. I'm sure I could get you a
No, but
line on it.
journalists talk about it. I noticed one wag said you're more likely to win Euro millions than you are to get IPSO to force you to publish an apology at the same size and in the same prominence as the original article if the article's untrue.
I guess one of the things that we were worried about at the time is the perception of total independence. So, and I think at the time that IPSO was being set up, we weren't comfortable with it.
We had the IPSO in a previous committee, the IPSO High Heaton in front of us, Supreme Boss, who was astonished to discover that newspapers might print retractions in smaller lettering than the original story. And he shared with the committee his surprise and that he felt he'd been slightly misled on this. I think I'm right in saying that IPSO have not once, since it was founded, required a front page apology of equal prominence to the story itself, which it ruled was inaccurate.
Again, that's really not for me to...
Just being a little bit counterintuitive,
Yeah.
because you're not an IPSO, so I thought I'd ask you about some of these. Now, another thing, David, that people have asked, and every politician will talk about, is stories that they themselves have been involved with, which they think are unfair. Now, I was interested in what you said earlier, and I wrote it down. You said that you have every confidence that your newspapers, your titles, conduct business in a fit and proper fashion. And I think Alison said that flat denials were always taken into account. Now, of all the stories I've been involved in, and I'm a journalist by training, so I know how to research a story, but of all the stories I've been involved in since I was first elected to Parliament in 2015, one of them stands out to me, and it was a story that was in The Sun, and it bears a little reprise, which was my office got a package sent to it. It was white crystals. We followed parliamentary procedure. We phoned parliamentary security. They called the police. The police closed down the streets and evacuated the office. The person concerned, I understand, was subsequently arrested. The police asked me not to talk to journalists about what they'd discovered. The Sun journalist called me up and he said, "What was in the package?" And I said, "I can't tell you, but the police have asked me not to say." The Sun journalist said, "Was it a biscuit?" And I went, "Of course it wasn't a biscuit. The police aren't going to close down a street for a biscuit, obviously. And I don't have the power to close down the streets, obviously. It's the police who've done that." And the Sun journalist said, "So that was a categorical denial." I said, "Categorical denial." So this was the story that the Sun then published. "Oh crumbs, suspicious package which caused major lockdown around SNP MP's office turns out to be a biscuit." Now, given a categorical denial, the journalist knew it was untrue. The journalist knew that an MP cannot close down a street. And the journalist must have known that was untrue. But let me tell you what the consequence of that is. First of all, this story is still on the Sun's website. Years later, I got trolled for days and days and weeks with people telling me I was an idiot, I'd wasted police time, I'd closed down a street for a biscuit, I'd destroyed the livelihood of shops operating there. I mean, at some levels you could say that was funny, but a lot of people believed it. And at the end of the day, my office had actually been sent something that was potentially dangerous. There were crystals that the police told me could be used to make an explosive device. What process does a newspaper go through that would result in that story being published and remain online years afterwards, despite clearly everyone involved knowing it's false?
What steps did you take after publication to get it removed from online?
I spoke to a senior executive at the Sun about it. I explained that it was untrue. I'd already spoken to the journalists concerned and told them that it was untrue. Everybody involved knew that it was untrue. I was left feeling that it was probably a deliberate attempt from a newspaper that isn't sympathetic to the SNP to spread a bit of disinformation. And it disappointed me because I've got great respect for the Sun's journalism. One of my close friends is Jane Moore, is a star columnist for the Sun. I love reading her columns. So I was disappointed in it, but
you didn't go to IPSO, you didn't pursue it further?
I didn't go to the independent regulator because I don't have much faith in the independent regulator. And then, end of the day, this is a huge splash. What IPSO would have done is in page 12, I put a tiny little box saying that it was untrue, and the copy.
If it was untrue, right, and
of course it was untrue. The police didn't close down the street because of a biscuit.
We haven't been able to investigate it, right? I'm hearing about this now. So if it was untrue and you went to IPSO, IPSO would have gone straight to the Sun, said this is the version of events from you. What's your defence on this? They would have got to a resolution. I suspect if your version is correct, there would have been a correction, it would have been taken down online, and that would have happened within a matter of hours or days.
Yes.
And we would not be sitting here today with it still online.
Well,
and that is there for every member of the public.
Two thoughts, David. The obvious one is it might be taken down online, although I complained to a senior executive who told me that it would be. And it hasn't been, and I didn't realise that until yesterday.
I can't discuss the specific case because I don't know the specific case.
Secondly, because the newspaper's been published, it's in every newsstand in the country. You can't take that back, and you can't do more as a politician than give a categorical denial to a journalist, and also rely on the journalist's common sense, because the journalist knows that the police will not examine a package, see a couple of Kit Kats and close down the street. So as a journalist, you as a journalist, we know that that would not happen. So you're left feeling there's a bit of malevolence at play, which, as I say, I find disappointing as a journalist, as somebody who admires the Sun's professionalism. And I just thought I'd flag that up because it was one particular example that I've come across when I went from poacher to gamekeeper and moved from journalism into politics.
Well, I'd say, and thank you for doing so, but I'd say that the courses of redress are there.
You accept that once the newspaper was out, the damage to me has already been done. The best that you could have offered me, if I'd gone through IPSO, would have been a retraction some time afterwards in much smaller lettering inside the newspaper. The fact that it appeared in the paper, there's no way of undoing that afterwards.
It would likely appear in the same place where the story appeared in the first place.
It would have.
I don't know where it appeared in the paper.
Very prominently. And my point remains that there hasn't been a single example of any story ever getting the same prominence as a front page story.
There have been front page apologies, which is since Simpson.
Not in the same, not the same degree of prominence.
I would agree with that, but there has been front page apologies, and I'm not sure you can, that's a significant move forward.
Sure.
Thank you. One last sort of quick question for each of you, and I'll start at the other end just to be fair to David. You've all had long, distinguished careers that have led you to the top of journalism. Do you think that trust in newspapers and their websites is higher or lower than when you started out in your careers?
I'm not sure. It's so long ago I started out. I'm not sure anybody was measuring it then. It's always going to be difficult being a journalist for a number of reasons. One is that you're reporting events as they happen, and there will always be different versions and different interpretations of what you report, and that will always affect people's view of you as a professional. I think if trust has declined, particularly in recent years, it may be because some of the big stories of recent years have been very divisive ones, where I'm thinking particularly of Brexit, but COVID as well in a way, where people have been divided within families in their opinions, and where people don't want to believe what they perceive to be contradictory to their point of view, and therefore there's a shoot the messenger attitude. And there's actually an illustration of that in the Reuters research into trust, recent research, which found that over the last 3 years, trust in the BBC, which normally scores very highly, had fallen from 75% to 55%. And they ascribed that to working class viewers disagreeing with the BBC's line on Brexit, and therefore not trusting the reporting. That's their observation, not mine. But so that's interesting. I also, I'm afraid, think there's the phenomenon where people are asked whether they trust in news, but as I mentioned earlier, they may actually be talking about what they read on TikTok rather than what comes from an outfit like us or the Mirror or the Guardian or the Times.
But basically lower. That's quite a pessimistic analysis. You can say there are reasons for it, but trust has gone down.
I'm not sure that it has. I think the Ofcom research shows it has in recent years, but they don't go back very far.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, if we could raise trust, it would be great.
I think the trustworthiness of the established news organisations has actually increased hugely to when I think back to sort of maybe the mid-80s. So I think the quality of the content that people are getting now is far more informative and responsible and well thought through. And I'm not just saying that because I'm in this role now, but I think if you looked back to some of the, particularly sort of like the Sun and the Mirror at that period and compare with it with the reporting that goes on today, I think it's hugely improved. However, I think we can't just look at sort of lack of trust in the media in isolation. I think it's something that every major institution in the country is facing: the police, politicians, doctors. So as a society, we've changed enormously. I mean, my grandparents' generation used to talk about their betters. You know, if a doctor told them this is what you had, that is what you had. Now people will go in and they'll question that, just they'll question the police and they'll question journalists. So, and you can argue that a lot of that's good because people are becoming much more questioning and sceptical about the world around them. But that obviously comes with a breakdown in trust. So how much of that is caused by social media and all the changes that I think probably a lot of it is, but I think it's just, there's all sorts of other sort of socioeconomic reasons that probably feed into that as well. So, but I think to put some good news in there as well, if you look, I think all the people here on this table, during COVID, we saw record numbers of people coming to us for the content that we were creating. We saw print sales holding up when you weren't barely allowed out the front door. And that is because people really wanted news they could trust at that point. And they knew that the established news organisations in this country were places they could get it. So yes, there was bad stuff happening in some places as well, but there was still a real hunger for trusted news, and we were able to fulfil that. So I think you can't look at us in isolation. I think if there is less trust in us, that's because there's less trust in most things now in this country.
I think it ebbs and flows. You know, as Alison has said, I think COVID, the whole pandemic, I think most news organisations, behaved really responsibly, and I think our readers reacted to that, and our readership soared, and I think that we showed that we could be trusted during a time of panic and emergency to provide trusted information. I also think that I actually feel quite hopeful when I think about the scandals in public life that have been brought to light by journalists, whether it's Barnard Castle or Partygate or any one of the investigations the Guardian's done in recent years. I mean, people really react to them. They will come to us and subscribe to us. They write to us and they tell us they want more of it, and our readership goes up. So, I feel hopeful that that in the future we can sustain the sort of the trusted voice that people relied on from us during the pandemic.
Yeah, I mean, I'm similarly bullish because I think the world in which we live has changed out of all recognition in the last 20, 25 years. The speed of information, we're now dealing on a second-by-second basis, and we've had to evolve to kind of meet that need. But I think the need for professional media, professional journalism has never been greater because there has never been more information out there. Somebody's got to make sense of it. Somebody has got to provide the raw material in the first place, and there is no one apart from us really doing that job. So actually, I think the future is bright, and it is important that we have a vibrant national media and local media in this country, which will only enhance democracy and trust at the same time.
Okay. Thank you all very much indeed for your time and insight this morning. David Dismore, Nick Hopkins, Alison Phillips, Peter Wright. Thank you very much. That concludes our session. Order.